Utah's Diamond Fork Hot Springs, a remote paradise known for its vivid blue pools and peaceful solitude. But for one couple, what should have been a quiet winter escape turned into something they'd never forget. In the deepening shadows of the forest, they weren't alone. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where we share true horror stories that will keep you looking over your shoulder long after the lights go out. If you are new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. We don't fail in bringing you with true horror stories. Tonight, we'll walk you through the chilling events at the hot springs, step by step. Stay with us. Diamond Fork Hot Springs, a remote paradise tucked deep into Utah's Wasatch Mountains, is known for its tranquil beauty, a place where milky blue pools bubble with warmth, surrounded by red rock canyons dusted in snow. It's a destination cherished by hikers and travelers alike, a secret spot for those willing to endure the miles-long trek through unforgiving wilderness. But beauty can hide darker truths, and for those who venture there, the silence of the mountains has a way of speaking to you in ways you don't expect. On a bitter January day, a young couple decided to hike to the springs. They were like any other, eager for adventure and convinced they'd find a few hours of peace away from the world. They had no reason to believe this hike would be different. The snow was fresh, the air crisp, and the promise of steaming waters waiting ahead was enough to keep them moving forward. The man had visited in the summer before, when the trail was alive with hikers. But winter was another story. The roads were blocked, the trail was empty, and there was no one else for miles. Despite its reputation as a place of beauty, whispers surround the springs. Hikers have spoken about strange experiences, odd sounds in the trees, shadows that seem to follow them, footsteps that don't belong to anyone in sight. Some believe it's the land playing tricks, others blame exhaustion or the isolation of the trail. Then there are those who speak of something else, something older, something watching. Stories passed down for years warn of figures seen between the trees, just out of reach, and a feeling of being watched that lingers long after leaving the canyon. Locals dismiss it as folklore, but if you ask those who've been there alone, they hesitate before they answer. The couple began their hike like any other. The trail was quiet, the snow absorbing sound and leaving them surrounded by an almost unnatural stillness. With every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, the landscape both breathtaking and oppressive. There's something about winter silence in the wilderness. No birdsong, no voices, just the distant wind and the echo of your own footsteps. It was peaceful, or so it seemed. The man noticed at first, an unease he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched farther than they should, or how the forest seemed to press in closer the farther they walked. At one point, they spotted something unexpected, a small hole carved into the mountainside, partially hidden behind a chain-link fence. It looked man-made, like an unfinished tunnel or an abandoned shelter. They climbed closer, curious. Inside, the darkness swallowed the edges of their flashlight beams. Old pipes ran along the floor, rusted and broken, leading to nowhere. There was nothing in there, and yet, the longer they stood at the mouth of that cave, the more wrong it felt. They left quickly, brushing it off as a distraction, but the feeling followed them. As they hiked deeper into the forest, time slipped away faster than they realized. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting shadows that seemed to move with the breeze. The silence grew more intense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The air was colder now, the warmth of the spring still far ahead, but neither of them wanted to turn back. After all, the springs were close, and nothing had really happened. Not yet. What they didn't know was that the forest was already paying attention to them. And by the time they realized it, there was no turning back. If you feel the chill already, don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales and stay with us, because this story only gets darker from here. The snow crunched under their boots, each step harder than the last as the cold gnawed at their faces. The couple had been walking for hours, the silence of the trail broken only by the occasional exhale of wind through the trees. The man led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gathering shadows, while his wife followed close behind. What began as an exciting hike was turning into something else entirely, something more grueling, more unsettling. The snow-covered path wound endlessly through the wilderness, its edges blending into the dense forest. The cold air was still, almost unnaturally so, with not a bird or animal in sight. Everything around them felt frozen, not just by the weather, but by something unspoken, something they couldn't quite identify. They pressed on, each step feeling heavier, their breaths clouded in front of them, disappearing into the pale gray air like smoke. Then they saw it, a break in the hillside, just to their right, a small, man-made hole carved into the mountain, partially covered by rusted chain-link fencing. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a shadow against the rock, easy to miss in the fading light. But up close, the details came into view. The entrance was crude, its edges jagged and uneven, as though someone had begun to dig and then abandoned the work halfway through. A few old pipes, rusted and broken, lay scattered just inside. The man shined his flashlight into the dark opening, the beam struggling to reach the back. Nothing moved. No sound came from within. "Looks like an old tunnel or something," he said, his voice low. His wife hesitated. "Let's keep going." But the man lingered for a moment longer, the light from his flashlight dancing off the pipes, casting strange shadows against the walls. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently, no footprints, no markings. And yet, the place felt wrong, as though it didn't belong. It was as if the mountain itself had rejected it, swallowing it up and leaving only this hollow, empty scar. They left the tunnel behind and continued along the trail, but the silence felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. The sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, draining the color from the landscape. The forest around them grew darker, the shadows longer and sharper. There were moments when the man thought he heard something faint, a soft rustling far off the trail. But every time he stopped to listen, it was gone. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trail opened up to the springs. The sight was stunning. Pools of milky blue water steamed against the cold air, the heat rising in soft tendrils that curled toward the sky. The sulfur smell was faint but unmistakable, a reminder of how the water bubbled up from deep underground. Snow blanketed the red rocks surrounding the springs, and the contrast between the white, the red, and the blue made the place look almost unreal, like something pulled from a dream. For the first time all day, the couple smiled. They'd made it. The man stripped off his jacket, shivering as the cold air bit at his skin, then eased into the warm water. The heat was instant relief, soothing the ache in his legs and numbing the chill in his fingers. His wife followed, sinking into the water with a sigh. For a while, they just sat there, leaning against the rocks, the quiet interrupted only by the faint sound of the waterfall upstream. "It's beautiful," his wife said softly. The man nodded, letting his eyes drift across the landscape. For a moment, everything felt normal, peaceful even. But then, without warning, something shifted. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more of a feeling, something in the air, something they couldn't see, but could sense. The man glanced around, scanning the tree line just beyond the edge of the springs. The shadows there seemed darker now, deeper, as though they were stretching themselves out toward the water. The sun had vanished completely, leaving only the faintest glow on the horizon. The woman shivered. "We should probably head back soon." The man agreed, but he didn't move. He was still staring at the trees, trying to pinpoint what was bothering him. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as though they weren't alone. The air grew colder, sharper, as though the warmth of the springs couldn't push back the night any longer. And that's when he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, something moved, just a flicker, like a shadow darting between the trees. He turned his head sharply, the water rippling around him. There was nothing there. The forest was empty. But the feeling lingered, that sense of being watched, of something standing just beyond the light, hidden in the dark. His wife noticed the change in his expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "We should get going." But as they climbed out of the water and began drying off, the feeling followed them. It was stronger now, like an unseen weight pressing down on them. The man glanced back at the springs one last time before they left. The water was still and quiet, steaming in the cold air. But for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something, a shape reflected in the water, tall and unmoving, standing at the edge of the springs. When he turned to look, it was gone. As they pulled their clothes back on and turned toward the trail, the forest seemed darker than before. The trees were silent, the path barely visible under the faint glow of their flashlights. The woman grabbed his hand, holding it tightly as they began their long walk back. Neither of them said a word, but deep down they both felt it. They were not alone. If you're feeling the chill creeping in, hit that subscribe button and join us for the rest of this story here on Eerie Road Tales. Because the worst is yet to come. The warmth of the springs lingered on their skin as they bundled up again, but the cold had become sharper, biting through their clothes and settling into their bones. They hadn't noticed how quickly the day had vanished. The mountains had swallowed the last light of the sun, and in its place, an impenetrable darkness wrapped around the forest. The couple stood in silence for a moment, staring down the path that would take them back to the road. The trail that had seemed so peaceful just hours ago now looked different, longer, unfamiliar, and far less forgiving. The man clicked on his flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the dark, illuminating only a small patch of the snow-covered trail in front of them. His wife did the same, her light shaking slightly as she adjusted her grip. The forest was quiet, save for the crunch of their boots against the snow. Each step felt deliberate, heavy, as though they were walking against an invisible force trying to keep them there. As they moved deeper into the trees, the silence began to press down on them. It was a silence that didn't feel natural. No wind, no distant water, no sound of animals. Just the steady rhythm of their footsteps, echoing far too loudly in the stillness. After a while, they stopped talking, focusing instead on the narrow, winding path ahead. The light from their flashlights didn't seem to stretch far enough. Everything beyond the reach of the beams was black, as though the forest had swallowed the rest of the world. Then it started. At first, it was faint, almost unnoticeable, a soft crunching sound, like snow being disturbed somewhere behind them. The man slowed his pace, straining to listen, and the sound stopped. He shook his head, forcing himself to believe it was nothing. Just the snow settling, he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. They pressed on, but the sound came again. This time it was louder, clearer, a slow, staggered crunch of footsteps following them, out of sync with their own. The man glanced at his wife. Her face was pale in the glow of her flashlight, her breath coming faster now, fogging the cold air. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, but said nothing. He didn't want to stop, didn't want to turn around. A growing weight settled in his chest, as though the darkness had begun creeping closer. The footsteps continued, sometimes faint, sometimes closer, but they were always there, matching their pace. The man finally turned, sweeping his flashlight over the trail behind them. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty snow-covered path and the black silhouettes of trees beyond. Nothing moved. The forest was still. But as he turned back, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from just beyond the light. They picked up their pace, the crunch of snow beneath their boots growing faster, more frantic. His wife held tightly to his hand, her light bouncing wildly with every step. The sound behind them didn't stop. It matched their pace, slow when they slowed, faster when they hurried, always just far enough away that they couldn't see anything. And then it happened. The man's flashlight caught something, a flicker of movement just at the edge of the beam. He froze. His wife stopped, her breathing sharp and shallow. Slowly, he swept the light back, trying to find whatever it was he'd seen. And there it was, a figure, tall, too tall. Its body was impossibly thin, its limbs stretched longer than they should have been. It stood perfectly still, just between the trees, where the light barely reached. He tried to focus on it, but before his eyes could adjust, it moved. Fast. Too fast. It darted to the side, vanishing into the blackness before he could get a good look. His wife gasped. "Did you see that?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They started walking again, this time faster. Their footsteps were loud, almost deafening now, but the footsteps behind them were louder, closer. The figure wasn't staying back anymore. It was moving, shadowing their path, always out of view, but never far enough away. The man could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath coming ragged as he fought the urge to break into a sprint. The trail felt endless. The darkness seemed to close in around them, suffocating, the trees pressing closer and closer as though they were alive. Then the footsteps changed. They weren't just behind them anymore. They were to the left, to the right, somewhere deeper in the woods, out of sight, but closing in. Twigs cracked. Snow crunched. Something moved between the trees, faster than they could comprehend. The couple began to run. They didn't speak, didn't look back. They just ran, their lights bouncing wildly across the snow-covered ground. The footsteps followed. They were loud now, thundering alongside them, the sound surrounding them from every direction. The man's chest burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Ahead, through the trees, a faint light appeared, a glow in the distance, the road, the car. They were close. "Run," he shouted, pulling his wife forward. The sound behind them was deafening now, like something enormous crashing through the forest. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel it, whatever it was, bearing down on them, just a step behind. They burst through the tree-line and stumbled onto the road. The car was only a few yards away, sitting in the pale glow of their headlights. The man fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold them. He yanked open the door, pulling his wife in behind him, and slammed it shut. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the only sound the roar of their breathing and the hum of the car's engine. Outside, the forest was still. The darkness loomed beyond the headlights, but there was nothing there. Nothing they could see. The man stared through the windshield, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His wife didn't speak. Neither of them looked back toward the forest. And then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the light, they heard it. A single crunch. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button and stay close. The next story is definitely darker than you think. The car's interior was silent except for the sound of their breathing, shallow, uneven gasps as they sat frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The man's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. Beside him, his wife stared straight ahead, her face lit by the faint glow of the dashboard. Neither of them looked back at the forest, but both of them could feel it, an invisible weight pressing against the car, as if the darkness itself were alive and watching. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. The headlights stretched weakly across the empty road ahead, cutting through the night but revealing nothing. Outside, the forest was still. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches unmoving in the windless night. There were no sounds of footsteps now, no crashing through the underbrush, only the thick, unnatural quiet of the wilderness that seemed to hold its breath. The man finally turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. The sound startled both of them. He looked over at his wife, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking in her lap. "Are you okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She didn't respond. Her eyes flickered nervously to the rearview mirror and then to the window. Slowly, her voice broke the silence, soft, barely more than a whisper. "There's someone at the tree line." The man's heart stopped for just a moment. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see, but he couldn't help himself. His eyes shifted to the edge of the forest, where the headlights faded into the black. At first there was nothing, just a wall of shadows and snow. But then, for the briefest of moments, he saw it. A shape. It wasn't moving. It wasn't hiding. It was standing just beyond the reach of the light, tall and possibly still, as though it were watching them. His chest tightened, and his pulse roared in his ears. He blinked hard, and when he looked again, it was gone. Nothing but the trees and darkness remained. "Did you see it?" his wife asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated. "No," he lied. "It's nothing. Let's go." The tires skidded slightly on the icy road as the man pressed his foot to the gas, speeding away from the trailhead. Neither of them looked back. The darkness swallowed the road behind them, but even as they drove, the feeling lingered, that suffocating sense of being watched. It stayed with them like a shadow, clinging to the edges of their minds as the car raced farther from the forest. They didn't speak for the rest of the drive. The man focused on the road, hands shaking on the wheel, while his wife sat silently beside him, staring out the window as though expecting to see something following them. When they finally reached their home, hours later, the man locked the doors and drew the curtains. He didn't sleep that night. Neither of them did. In the days that followed, they tried to talk about what had happened, tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal, they told each other. Maybe the footsteps were echoes, the shadow in the trees a trick of their flashlights. But deep down, they both knew that wasn't true. The man avoided the springs after that night. Every time he thought of going back, he felt that same knot of dread tighten in his stomach, the memory of the figure in the trees flashing behind his eyes. His wife refused to even talk about it. Any mention of the hike brought her back to the darkness, the footsteps, the overwhelming certainty that they had been followed by something that didn't want to be seen. Months passed, and the snow melted, giving way to spring. Hikers returned to the Diamond Fork Hot Springs, sharing photos of the bright blue pools and the red rocks glowing in the sun. To everyone else, It was a paradise, a quiet retreat from the world. But to the couple, it was something else, a place that held secrets, something they weren't meant to encounter. The man still thinks about that night sometimes, when he's lying in bed in the quiet hours before dawn. He remembers the silence of the forest, the footsteps that grew louder, and the figure that waited just beyond the light. He'll tell himself it was his imagination, a trick of exhaustion and fear. But then, in the back of his mind, he'll hear it again, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow, always just out of sight. And in those moments, he knows the truth. There are places in this world where we don't belong, places that watch us as we pass through, waiting for us to make a mistake. And if you're not careful, you might realize too late that you're not alone. If you're still here with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us again on Eerie Road Tales. Because some roads lead to places you'll wish you'd never found. There are places in this world that defy explanation. Places where the line between reality and something other begins to blur. The Diamond Fork Hot Springs is one of those places. What really happened that night? Were they followed by something flesh and blood, a person, maybe someone who lived on the fringes of society, hidden in the wilderness? It's possible, but unlikely. No tracks, no voices, just footsteps that matched theirs until they ran. Could it have been an animal? The forest is home to predators, cougars, perhaps, but animals don't stand still at the edge of a tree line. They don't watch. And nothing in the natural world moves like that figure did, fast, erratic, vanishing into the darkness as though it was part of it. For those familiar with the region's folklore, other explanations begin to surface. The stories of the skinwalkers, cursed spirits from Navajo legends, come to mind. These beings are said to roam the wilderness, shifting between forms, haunting those who stumble into their territory. People who've claimed encounters with skinwalkers describe feelings of being watched, strange figures just out of sight, and sounds that mimic footsteps, voices, even laughter. Could the couple have crossed into something they weren't meant to see? This isn't the first time hikers have spoken of strange occurrences in remote, untouched wilderness. There are accounts too many to dismiss, of shadowy figures lurking in forests, of footsteps echoing behind travelers with no one in sight, and of that indescribable feeling that you're being followed, no matter how alone you appear to be. The stories are scattered, but the details are eerily consistent. Perhaps the wilderness holds secrets older than we know, and when we wander too far, we brush against them. What do you think? Was it paranoia brought on by exhaustion and darkness, or did the couple encounter something far beyond understanding? Do you believe the wilderness hides secrets that we aren't meant to uncover? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story gave you chills, don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales for more terrifying adventures. Because sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. What do you think truly happened that night? Was it something natural, something human, or something far beyond explanation? Share your thoughts below. And if this story left you with chills, remember to hit that like button and subscribe to Eerie Road Tales so you never miss a haunting story. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the road ahead may not always lead where you expect.